Here, at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street, was what I think must be the strangest disaster in London's history. I speak of the Great Beer Flood. From 1764 to 1921, before there was a theatre here, this was the site of the Horseshoe Brewery. Beer was big business at the time. What was more, it was considered quite a respectable drink for the working man. Tea would start to overtake it in popularity in the early 19th century, as it became more affordable, but in the meantime, beer would do nicely. It was considered less detrimental than gin, and it was certainly safer than water. William Hogarth extolled its virtues in his engraving Beer Street. The Horseshoe Brewery's particular speciality was porter. Porter is a dark beer, originating in London, and in the early 19th century it was hugely popular, particularly with labourers. The name actually comes from its popularity with market porters. Brewers also liked it because you could produce a decent batch by only maturing a small amount, then mixing it into a larger quantity of less mature beer. The Horseshoe Brewery, owned by Mew & Co., was one of the largest producers, putting out over 100,000 barrels a year. I mention all this so you'll get some idea of how this disaster could have happened. To meet demand, the Horseshoe Brewery had a number of wooden vats on its roof, each holding thousands of barrels of porter. On the 17th of October, 1814, a clerk, George Crick, reported that one of the iron bands around one of the vats had come loose. It wasn't considered a priority for repair. With the expansion and contraction of the wooden vats, such incidents were far from unknown, and they never had any consequences. The vats were sturdy and strong, or so everyone thought. An hour later, though, they would be proven wrong in spectacular fashion. Crick reported hearing a loud crash. The vat had burst. As it did so, the beer that came flooding out damaged a neighbouring vat as well as 4 smaller vats. The storeroom below rapidly filled with between 8,000 and 9,000 barrels worth of beer. It was too much for the building to take, and the rear wall literally exploded. A 15-foot tsunami surged down New Street, a short street behind, bringing with it the wreckage of the brewery. The force was enough to destroy 2 houses and damage 2 more. A child, Hannah Bamfield, was in one of the houses and was killed. Eleanor Cooper, a servant working at the Tavistock Arms, a nearby pub, died when a wall collapsed on top of her. One child, Sarah Bates, was drowned. In a particularly grim event, 5 mourners at a wake for a deceased infant were killed in the destruction of the second house. The area around New Street was a particularly poor and crowded slum. This was the St. Giles Rookery. Families living in basements and cellars were forced to flee as the beer poured into their homes. There are tales of locals unable to believe their luck, grabbing as much free beer as they could and drinking themselves to death. It's a darkly funny story, but I can't seem to find anything concrete on who was killed in this manner, or even how many. Actually, contemporary reports seem to indicate that, if anything, the behaviour of the locals was exemplary, assisting with rescue efforts however they could. There was, however, a macabre postscript. The families of St. Giles were, in many cases, desperately poor, and some of the families of victims resorted to exhibiting the bodies of their loved ones to raise the funeral costs. In one case, the exhibit was so popular that the floor collapsed, dropping all present into the still flooded basement. The local watchman, too, turned a pretty penny by charging 2pence to look at the wreckage of the brewery. The disaster was ruled an act of God, the brewery itself being found not liable for the destruction. In their defence, as I said earlier, damage to vats was fairly common, and Crick and his superiors had no reason to believe this incident would be any different. Nevertheless, from then on, breweries would be built with concrete vats to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. The Horseshoe Brewery closed in 1921. By this time, the Rookery of St Giles had been redeveloped and New Street no longer existed. Rumours persist that for years the smell of beer hung in the air. 200 years later, it's easy to look on this accident as something funny and quirky. I mean, drowning in beer. What a way to go. No wonder the story's been embellished with tales of drunken revelry. It's obviously missing from the real events. But I can't help but think that for the residents of New Street, it was no laughing matter. Hello all, I hope you enjoyed this video on one of London's more unusual disasters. If you did, then please do hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you again very soon. Cheerio.